Oh, yeah.
Alex and I could do a little duet.
Yeah.
You ready to sing?
Yeah.
I can't sing a note.
Keep hearing all those motorcycles tonight. There's a lot of them. Lots of motorcycles. Anybody have a favorite hymn tonight?
What's your favorite?
Oh, I have a lot. I just let y'all pick. Four 26. The Lord's Prayer.
Have you ever sang this one?
I remember a certain wedding.
Yeah. How'd that work out? Wasn't your fault, though.
And okay, I'm gonna do it in a different book. 462. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Alan. That was good. I love to hear you sing that one.
Okay, Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20. That song sort of brings back memories for me. When I was a freshman in college, I was selected to be in a performance with the Metropolitan Opera from New York, which was being performed there in Cleveland, at the Cleveland Met there, which the audience held 10,000. But I got to be in the chorus of, the name of the opera was called I Am the Way, and the person that wrote it played the part of Jesus, and his name was Jerome Hines. So I got to sing with him in the Met and in Cleveland. So that was, and one of the songs, of course, was the Lord's Prayer. Different arrangement, but all right. So we're Exodus chapter 20. Just an update. I got word from Janet a few minutes ago that she is feeling much better. I want to make sure I get this right. She's starting to feel better. The pain is almost gone. She said she didn't lose any sense of smell or taste. She has congestion, but she doesn't think it's as bad. Can you hear me okay? A reverb, yeah, it's probably feeding back. So Exodus chapter 20 will be tonight, starting at verse 12. Let's pray. Father, again, we're thankful tonight that we have more time in your word. We thank you that you give us this for us as your children, and that these things that happened to Israel are, you've told us as you inspired Paul to write in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, that are there for ensamples or examples or types for us. And as we've been looking at the book of Hebrews on Sunday mornings and seeing that you're warning us to not do the same thing that they did as a nation, where they were stubborn and hardened their hearts. So, Father, help us to see that as we look at these things in the book of Exodus tonight. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So, Exodus chapter 20, we're still here in the Ten Commandments, starting tonight in verse 12, Exodus 20:12. Honor thy father and thy mother. When I was just a kid studying this, I thought, or got the impression from everybody teaching, that meant obey your parents. That's not what this is talking about. Children should obey their parents, but honor thy father and the mother, even when you grow up and you become an adult and most cases move out of the house. This means, of course, especially slightly different today. I mean, it still applies for certain, but there are ways that have been set up, at least in the United States of America, where there's something that's called Social Security. So people have something to live on later in life. And so typically it doesn't happen not too long ago. Several generations would live in the same household, because when the parents would retire, they'd move in with one of the children and their family. So that still happens, but not as much. But the honor your father and mother is to take care of them when they're no longer able to take care of themselves. And now, in some cases where people can't do that, there are at least facilities where that can be done, where they can be taken care of. But that's what this honor your father and mother means. And then it says, if you do that, that the days may be long, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God gives you. So here we see that, as Jesus talks about it, it's the only commandment with a promise that it's good for us to do this and not neglect it. And by the way, we don't get to it here, but the opposite of honoring your father and mother is called cursing them. And if honoring them is to take care of them, then cursing them is to not do so. Verse 13, the next one, thou shalt not kill. The word means from the Hebrew murder, and the reason I distinguish, as we're going to get as we get further in to the details, there is sometimes, like if a person is killing out of self-defense, that's not considered murder. The murder that it's talking about here is actually first-degree murder. It's premeditated, planned-out murder. It's not accidental murder, which we call manslaughter. And there were different things that would happen to the person who, there's a city of refuge and all that. But thou shalt not murder. So that is taking a life, premeditation, and knowingly taking a life. It is distinguished, of course, if you are fighting for your country and your country sends you out in battle, and those others, the enemy that you kill, you're not taken to court and charged with murder because you're defending the country. So that's what I mean. There is, it's talking about murder, and it'll be explained later. Now, verse 14. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Paul spends a lot of time talking about this one because of all the sins. This one has more consequences. It doesn't just affect the two married couples that are being that where one of the spouses is being unfaithful, but it affects those families. It affects the extended families, particularly when there's children, and so forth. So God hates all sin. And these are all in the commandments. He doesn't want us to do any of them. But some sins have more consequences. Some of the sins, if you do some of these things that we shouldn't do, the consequences aren't quite as severe. Because in some cases, some of the things only affect you, the person who's sinning. But adultery affects other people. So thou shalt not commit adultery. Verse 15. Thou shalt not steal. Of course, a lot of stealing is justified, or people think they're justifying it because they say, oh, well, this doesn't count. As what they think of as, it suddenly got quieter, but I could. Fringe benefits. As I told you, I've told the story. I'll try to tell a different one, slightly different one. But when I was teaching school, it got to the point that so many people were using the copy machine to copy gobs of stuff. I mean, a lot. And that costs money. It costs money for the stuff on the printer. It costs money for the paper. And when a lot of teachers were doing it a lot, it was costing a lot more money. So they finally we each had a code, a 4-digit code, that we had to put in there, and it kept track of how many copies we were making. That way they were aware of who was using what. It was a way to watch that. Because though some of the teachers were justifying it, saying, well, I work here and there's a copy machine, so I'll just help myself. Well, that could sometimes get out of hand. It's not like you're copying one personal paper even. But I think it would only be appropriate, even if it's one paper, to ask, may I make a copy of this? But just to go in and make hundreds of copies of something so that you don't have to go to a copy place and spend so many pennies per copy. Anyway, thou shalt not steal. Verse 16, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, neighbor has a broader meaning now than it did then, but those that we live in the community with, we shouldn't go to court and tell a falsehood about them. Now, again, there's a lot more detail coming up about that too, but here it's just stated plainly in the commandments. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Verse 17, thou shalt not covet your neighbor's house. And then you notice immediately it says, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. And then the stuff after wife, which we'll get to. But as I pointed out to you, if you count all the thou shalt nots, there's 12 of them. And so, but we say 10 commandments. So as I said, in the Catholic Church, they take the first, what we count as the first two, and they join them together as one, and they split this one in verse 17, thou shalt not covet, they split it into two. That you shouldn't covet your neighbor's goods, that's one commandment, and you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. So I don't know. To me, I think it was a convenient way of sticking the second commandment up amongst the first, that thou shalt have no graven images, that sort of nobody would notice it. But that's what they have done. All right? So the word covet often in the Bible has to do with greed. It's wanting more, trying to get what somebody else has. There's an expression, keeping up with the Joneses. And, somebody, and your next door neighbor went out and got a new grill. I think, well, I got to go out and get a new grill. Or they got a jacuzzi, I got to get a jacuzzi. They got an RV, I got to get an RV. It's that kind of thing, wanting what they have, and this constant, this greed. So we shouldn't covet what they have, whether it be their house. Here it says the man shouldn't covet their neighbor's wife, nor his manservant or his maidservant, so the male and female servants, nor his ox, the ox is another word for a bull, nor his ass, that would be the donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So all of this is in the Ten Commandments. And as I mentioned, as Jesus brought out, I didn't say it tonight until right now, but when Jesus was asked about the commandments, which is the most important, and he summed up the first 4 commandments having to do with our relationship to God. I think I said it this morning. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then the second, he said, is love your neighbor as yourself. So it sums up, if we love those around us, if we treat them like we treat ourselves, then we wouldn't be doing these things, right? If you think about it, we wouldn't be murdering our neighbor because we wouldn't murder ourselves. We wouldn't be committing adultery or stealing, bearing false witness in court, or coveting what they have. Verse 18. And all the people saw the thunderings and the lightnings and the noise of the trumpet and the mountain smoking. As I said, I happen to believe this was probably an active volcano, but whatever it was, they saw all this and they heard the noises. And when the people saw it, they removed and stood afar off. It was scary to them. So they stood back. Verse 19. They said to Moses, speak thou with us, and we'll hear. In other words, we'll listen. But let not God speak with us, lest we die. Now, if you remember from the beginning when we saw these commandments, this thick cloud appeared, and God wanted them to hear him speak. So they hear the voice of God, and then when he completes what we just read in verse 17, then they saw thunderings and lightnings, and they hear this loud trumpet. There's smoke pouring out of the mountain, and they're scared. So they tell Moses, you speak to God, and then tell us what God says. And the reason they give in verse 19, lest we die. They were afraid. Verse 20, and Moses said to the people, fear not, for God has come to prove you, again the word test. He's going to test you, that his fear may be before your faces, that ye sin not. He's trying to make a point. He's trying to get you to do and know who he is and why you should do it. Verse 21. And the people stood afar off, and Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. So Moses gets closer, they stood back. Verse 22. And the Lord said to Moses, thus, meaning like this, thou shalt say to the children of Israel, ye have seen that I have talked with you from heaven. So he said, remind them, they just heard me speak. Out of that thick cloud, they heard my voice. So remind them of that. Verse 23. And then say to them, ye shall not make with me gods of silver. In other words, these were idols. And this was in the beginning of the commandments, right? Thou shalt make no graven images. Well, this is the first thing that he wants Moses to remind him. Don't make gods out of silver. Neither shalt they make to you gods of gold. So don't do that. Don't take precious metals and do that. We all know what they're about to do, but this is the first warning they have. Don't do it. Because as you know, not too far from here in the book of Exodus it records, Moses goes up to the mount, and while he's gone, they melt down all the silver and gold they got from the Egyptians and make an idol to worship. So in verse 24, an altar of earth shalt thou make to me. They were to make it, it had to be out of the ground, out of clay and stuff. And shalt sacrifice thereon your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. So he said, you're going to build the altar, has to be made out of the earth. And that's where you do your burnt offerings and your peace offerings. We'll learn more about those in Leviticus. And in those offerings is your sheep, your oxen, so those were all part of the offerings. In all places where I record my name, remember the presence of God. As they were moving through the wilderness, they had the tabernacle, which was a big tent to worship. And so God's presence was there. And every time they moved, God's presence was moving with them. Later they get the temple, was the presence of God. Now the presence of God is within us as believers, so we don't have to do like they did. But it says, in all the places where I record my name, I will come to you and I will bless you. Verse 25, and if you will make me an altar of stone, that was the only other option they had, but particular warnings about the stones. Thou shalt not build of it of hewn stone. So they couldn't chisel the stones. It had to be just normal rocks. They couldn't do anything to them if they were going to build the altar out of stone. For if you lift up your tool upon it, you have polluted it. He wanted the altar to not be something that they worked on with their tools, because that would pollute it and it couldn't be used for the sacrifices. Verse 26, neither shalt thou go up by steps to my altar, that your nakedness be not, and the word discovered means uncovered thereon. What they mean are the robes. So in the beginning here, they were warned about this. I actually often, not that I experienced it, I want to make that clear, but I often thought about this in the late 60s and early 70s, where women's dresses and skirts were getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And they called them the mini skirts. And they were so high that if you were behind a girl or woman as she was going up a flight of stairs, there wasn't much she could hide in that sense. So not that it would be nakedness, which sometimes seems strange here because you would think they had something underneath. But this is given, that they weren't allowed to go up the steps to the altar. All right, chapter 21. Now these are the judgments. The word judgments are laws. They're the rules or the regulations which thou shalt set before them. So he tells Moses, you're going to tell them all this. Verse 2. If you buy a Hebrew servant, now it's different from other servants if they got a slave. If it was a Hebrew person that they hired to work for them, so to speak, and that's what the servant was. So if you buy, and they actually purchased them, different where that's outlawed now, the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, so that you can't own a person. You can hire them, but you can't own them. So here, if you buy a Hebrew servant, 6 years he will serve. In the 7th, he will go out free for nothing. He doesn't have to pay anything to be freed. He is free at that point. Now, notice the significance of the 6 days and then the 7th. All of this is pointing to the millennial kingdom. And it is in the millennial kingdom that all the curses will be lifted, including being servants. Verse 3. If he came in by himself, he shall go out by himself. In other words, if he wasn't married, he didn't have a family when he was hired, then that's how he leaves. If he were married, then his wife shall go out with him. So she gets to go. If he's freed, it's his 7th year. He comes in married, she is free to go as well. Verse 4. If his master have given him a wife, that is, while being this hired servant, if the master have given him a wife, and she have borne him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he'll go out by himself. In other words, the wife who was given to him in marriage has to stay with the master. The children have to stay with the master. Only the slave gets to go. You see, that's because he married after he was there. Verse 5, if the servant shall plainly say, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. So the servant has that right to say, I don't want to leave without him. Verse 6, then his master shall bring him to the judges. It says, he shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl. So this is a tool they'd use to put a hole in the ear, and he shall serve him forever. So in other words, he doesn't want to leave his wife and children. He agrees that he's not going to be released the 7th year. He's just going to keep working forever. And it had to go before the court, though, for this to happen. Verse 7, if a man sell his daughter to be a maid servant, so the rule is a little different for the men servants and the women servants. So if a man sells his daughter, he makes money off of this, selling his daughter to be a maid servant, she shall not go out as the men servants do. So she doesn't have the same privilege to get to leave on the 7th year. Verse 8, if she please not her master, if he's not happy, who has betrothed her to himself, in other words, sometimes this maid servant would become engaged to the master, and if he's not happy with her, then shall he let her be redeemed. In other words, the father can buy his daughter back. To sell her to a strange nation, he shall have no power. He can't do that. If he is not happy with her, he can only let the father buy her back. He can't sell her into another country, seeing he hath dealt deceitfully with her. And that's because he's wanted her and then decided he doesn't want her. Verse 9, and if he have betrothed her to his son, if he's given this maidservant to his son, he shall deal with her after the manner of daughters. And if he take him another wife, her food, her raiment, and her duty of marriage shall he not diminish. In other words, even if he takes another wife, he can't, well, I forgot to explain at the end of verse 9. He has to treat her like one of his own daughters. She's a daughter-in-law, but he has to treat her like a daughter. And then this one, if he marries her, but then he takes another wife, because this was polygamy back then, but yet her food and her clothes and her duty of marriage, in other words, to be intimate, shall he not diminish. He couldn't say, because he got another wife now, and just discard her. Verse 11, and if he do not these three to her, and the three was the ones just mentioned. Number 1 was in verse 8, and number 2, verse 9, and then number 3, what we just read. So if he do not these three to her, then shall she go out free without money. In other words, if he doesn't agree to any of these terms, then she can be free, even though initially in verse 7 she was not to be. Verse 12. Now these are more rules that they have to follow. He that smites a man so that he die, in other words, it's not just hits him, but somehow he hits him and the person dies, shall be surely put to death. All right, the person killed a person, and so their life has to be taken. The next one, verse 13. If a man lie not in wait, but God deliver him into his hand, then, he says, I will appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. Now what that means is, if the death is accidental, in other words, this was not premeditated, and it was accidental, then that person can go to a place of refuge that God prepared for them so that they're protected. Verse 14. If a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, thou shalt take him from my altar that he may die. So the same thing as in verse 12. He has to be put to death, but even if he's clinging to the altar, they have to take him and kill him because the murder was presumptuous and it was with guile. Verse 15. He that smites his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And the implication again is smiting to kill. So this is what we call patricide and matricide. If he does that, he has to die. Verse 16. He that steals a man and sells him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. The steal here is kidnap. So kidnapping was punishable by death as well. Verse 17. He that curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Remember it said, honor your father and mother? This is the opposite of that, and that was the penalty. A lot of these, the penalties were pretty severe. For them not to take care of their parents would surely be put to death. Verse 18, if men strive together, if there's a fight going on, and one smite another with a stone or with his fist, and he die not, but keeps his bed. In other words, he doesn't get killed, but he's crippled, and he can't get out of bed anymore. Verse 19, if he rise again, let's say he's just in bed for a while, if he rise again and walks abroad upon his staff, in other words, maybe he has just a cane, then shall he that smote him be quit. In other words, he's acquitted. He's not guilty because the person recovered. But, with this one exception, only he shall pay for the loss of his time. So if that person couldn't work for a certain amount of time, he has to pay him back. And shall cause him to be thoroughly healed, whatever the costs were, he's responsible. And by the way, as we go through all these, notice how detailed everything is. But this was really set up so when there were court issues for the Israelites to deal with, and there were millions of them out here in the desert, they were to follow all these. It was very detailed. Verse 20, if a man smite his servant or his maid, so the male servant or the female servant, with a rod, and he die under his hand, he shall be surely punished. Now, it's a little different here. Rather than being put to death, he is punished for hitting his slave. Verse 21, notwithstanding, if he continue a day or two, in other words, if he lives, he'll be punished, for he is his money. In other words, that punishment is because he paid for him. Verse 22, if men strive and hurt a woman with child, so there's a fight going on, somehow a pregnant woman is in the middle somehow and gets injured, so that her fruit depart from her, the baby is born, whether it's a miscarriage or what happens, the baby comes out, and yet no mischief follow, nothing bad happens, then he shall be surely punished according to the woman's husband. So he's the one that sets the standard here. Will lay upon him whatever he says, and he shall pay as the judges determine. So this sometimes had to be taken to court, and the judge determined how much these two men that were fighting have to pay for the woman who had the child before it was time. Verse 23, and if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. In other words, if this baby that came early actually dies, then a life is taken for a life. The person, the two that are fighting have to die because of it. And then we see this expression, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This is brought out in the New Testament. Hand for hand, foot for foot, burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. A stripe means a bruise. Now, what does that mean? It essentially meant that the punishment, whatever the sentence was to fit the crime. It was supposed to be reasonable and fit the crime for which they did. So in other words, besides all those that were just detailed, that's basically, it wasn't necessarily literal. If you gouge out a person's eye, they'd have to gouge out yours. But it just has the general meaning. The punishment was to fit the crime. So that way they didn't have to go on and on and on with more examples. All right, verse 26. If a man smite the eye of a servant or the eye of her maid, that it perish, he shall let him go free for his eye's sake. In other words, they get injured, one of their eyes gets injured, they get to go free. They no longer have to stay a servant. Verse 27. If he smite out his manservant's tooth or his maidservant's tooth, hits and they lose a tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. So even a tooth, they get to go. Verse 28. If an ox gore a man or a woman, so you got a bull, and it charges somebody, and it causes them to die, then the ox will be surely stoned, and his flesh shall not be eaten. When they stone the ox, they're not allowed to eat the flesh. But the owner of the ox shall be quit, which again means acquitted or cleared. He's not guilty because this ox did this. Now, we're going to see in a moment that's if it's the first time. There's no history of this. Now, it would have broken rules if they would have eaten the flesh of the ox that was stoned, because it has to be bled appropriately and so forth. And so anyway, they weren't allowed to eat it, but they were to stone the ox. Verse 29. But if the ox were wont, that word meaning known, to push with his horn in time past. If this is something the ox has done before, and it hath been testified to his owner, in other words, the owner's been told, you better keep your bull pinned up. It'd be like if a person owned a Rottweiler, and the Rottweiler had attacked someone, and the court gave them warning. You got to keep your Rottweiler in, and the person ignored it. Well, then there's a different punishment. It says, so the owner's been told, and he hath not kept him in, but that he hath killed a man or a woman, the ox will be stoned, and his owner also will be put to death, because now he's responsible for the death. The first time, there was a little leeway, and the animal was stoned. Obviously, they often do that actually with dogs. Often the dog is kept for a while to make sure there's not something wrong with it first. But if it has this behavior, then the animal has to be put down. And we don't have a law like that then puts the owner down, but sometimes I think the owner probably should be responsible. All right, then in verse 30, if there be laid on him a sum of money, then he will give for the ransom of his life whatsoever is laid upon him. So he has the option to pay a certain amount of money so that he doesn't have to die. Verse 31, whether he have, that he, the ox, have gored a son or have gored a daughter, according to this judgment shall it be done to him. So if he agrees to pay the amount of money that the court set up, then he doesn't have to be killed. Verse 32, if the ox shall push the manservant or the maidservant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and that's the price of a servant. So this person, the master, loses one of their slaves, then they have to pay them 30 shekels of silver to recoup the cost that they paid for the servant. And the ox shall be stoned. So the ox is still stoned. Verse 33, if a man shall open a pit, that means uncover a well. Or if a man shall dig a pit, that is, dig a new well, and not cover it, they forget to put something over it. It'd be like, say you got road workers out there working, and they forget to put up warnings and forget to put a plate across, and it's a pretty deep hole, and somebody falls in and gets injured. So that's what it's saying. If they don't do that, and an ox or an ass fall in, so a bull or a donkey falls in the hole, verse 34, the owner of the pit shall make it good, and give money to the owner of them, the owner of the bull or the donkey, and the dead beast shall be his. In other words, he pays for it, but then he gets to have the dead bull, or in the case of a dead donkey. Verse 35, and if one man's ox hurt another, so this is an animal hurting another animal, that he die, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money of it. And the dead ox also they shall divide, right, because they still have the meat. Verse 36, or if it be known that the ox hath used to push in time past, again like the other example, he's had a history of this, and his owner has not kept him in, he shall surely pay ox for ox, he has to pay for the whole thing, and the dead shall be his own. Verse 22. We have a few more of these, and then it moves on to other stuff, but if a man shall steal an ox or a sheep and kill it, so you got a robber here, he comes and takes somebody's bull, or he takes a sheep, and he kills it, or he sells it, then he has to pay back 5 times for the oxen and 4 for the sheep. So this is spelled out exactly. If he's caught, obviously he has to be caught to do it, but he has to pay back 5 times as much for the ox and 4 times for the sheep. Verse 2. And then it says, if a thief be found breaking up, that means breaking in after dark. That's what breaking up is. And be smitten that he die. In other words, the owner sees this robber coming in and he kills him. It says in verse 2, there shall no blood be shed for him. In other words, the owner who's being broken into, he's not guilty of killing. Verse 3, if the sun be risen upon him. In other words, if the robber comes during the daytime, there shall be blood shed for him. In other words, if the owner kills him then in daylight, then he's responsible for having killed him. Now the 4 is not in the Hebrew, so you can, that's why it's italicized, so I have it crossed out in my Bible. He should make full restitution. If he have nothing, if he doesn't have anything to do that with, then he shall be sold for his theft. So the robber has to make full restitution in this case, but he has to be sold for his theft if he doesn't have anything. Verse 4, if the theft be certainly found in his hand alive, if he still got it, whether it be ox or donkey or sheep, he shall restore double. So that's how much the restitution is. He has to pay back twice. Verse 5, if a man shall cause a field or a vineyard to be eaten, and shall put in his beast, and shall feed in another man's field, of the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard shall he make restitution. In other words, he lets his animals graze in someone else's field. Then that's the punishment for them. Verse 6, if fire breaks out and catch in thorns. The thorn here are literally in the Hebrew thorn bushes. I had a run-in with the thorn bush. One time I was doing mountain biking in the the Caribbean, in the island called St. Martin. And the paths sometimes were only about a foot wide, and it was dirt paths. Sometimes there were rocks in the path. So I hit a rock. It threw me this way into the bush. Now these thorn bushes had thorns about 2 inches long, 2 to 3 inches. And all these thorns across the side of my body just scraped. Well, I felt something, but it wasn't really painful. So when we got down to the bottom of the hill, they had to clean all that off and fill out an incident report because all of those thorns scraped me and I was bleeding from all the scrapes. So that's what I think of when I think of thorn bushes. But anyway, but they're dry bushes, so I can see why they would catch on fire. So if this happens, a fire breaks out, and it catches the thorn bushes, so that the stacks of corn, the word corn here is the grain, usually it was wheat, but it could be barley, the stacks of grain or the standing grain or the field, the whole field, be consumed, he that kindled the fire shall surely make restitution. If it's his fault, he has to pay for it. Verse 7, if a man shall deliver to his neighbor money or stuff to keep, says, would you keep this for me? And it be stolen out of the man's house, if the thief be found, let him pay double. Then the thief pays back double. If, verse 8, if the thief be not found, then the master of the house will be brought to the judges. All right, so remember, he's just keeping his neighbor's stuff. But he has to be taken to court then, to see whether he have put his hand into his neighbor's goods, to see maybe he's guilty of taking it, if they can't find the thief. Verse 9, for all manner of trespass, that is offense, whether it be for an ox or an ass or a sheep, for clothes, or for any manner of lost thing, this is talking about property, anything disappears, which another challenges to be his. In other words, they say, that's mine and it's gone. The cause of both parties shall come before the judges. So it has to be decided in the courts. And whom the judges shall condemn, whoever they decide is guilty, then he shall pay double to his neighbor. So he has to replace it, but double. Verse 10, if a man deliver up his neighbor an ass or an ox or sheep or any beast to keep, and it die or is hurt, meaning injured, or driven away, so it's gone somewhere, and no man has seen it, verse 11, then shall an oath of the Lord be between them both. They have to promise and make this oath, that he hath not put his hand to his neighbor's goods. He has to say, swear in front of God that he did not do it. And the owner of it shall accept. He's required by law to accept what this person says. And he shall not make it good. Verse 12. And if it be stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner thereof. So he's watching it and it's stolen. He has to make restitution. Verse 13. If it be torn in pieces, if the animal is torn by another animal, then let him bring it for witness. In other words, show, look it, this is the animal, it was torn up. And he shall not make good that which was torn. In other words, it's really not his fault. Verse 14, if a man borrow aught, which means anything of his neighbor, and it be hurt or die, the owner thereof being not with it, he shall surely make it good, if he wasn't there. Verse 15, but if the owner thereof be with it, he shall not make it good. If it be a hired thing, it came for his hire. In other words, if it was paid for to rent. All right, now verse 16. If a man entice a maid that is not betrothed, okay, she's not engaged to anyone, but he's interested in her, and he lie with her, so he has intimate relations, he shall surely endow her to be his wife. He is required to pay the dowry to the girl's family. It usually goes to the father. To the father, he's required to marry her. Now it says, if her father utterly refused to give her to him, he can choose to not allow the marriage. He shall pay money according to the dowry of virgins. He still has to pay the dowry. Verse 18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Now they were referring to those who practiced magic, and they weren't allowed to let them live. You all remember there's a city in the U.S. called Salem, and that's one of the things it was known for. People kept accusing different people of being witches. And witches are real, but I don't know if in Salem they got out of hand with that, it seems. So thou shalt not allow, the word suffer means allow, they're not allowed to allow a witch to live. Verse 19, whosoever lies with a beast shall be surely put to death. So being intimate with an animal was not permitted. Verse 20, he that sacrifices to any god except to the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. The word utterly destroyed means sentenced to death. Sentenced to death. Verse 21. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger, it means to cheat them, that is a foreigner. They weren't allowed to do that, nor oppress him. And why were they told that? For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So he said, don't forget what you were like living in another country. So you're not allowed to take advantage of foreigners. Verse 22. You shall not afflict, which means to harm any widow. Not only did the Israelites do a lot of this stuff, and when at Jesus' time in the first century, this was still a problem where people were taking advantage of widows. Or fatherless child, so the orphans, they weren't allowed to hurt them. Verse 23, if you afflict them in any wise, that is in any way, in any manner, and they cry at all to me, if the widows or these orphans cry out, God says, they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will wax hot, it'll grow hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children will be fatherless. Verse 25, if you lend money to any of my people that is poor by you, so poor people, and you lend them money, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer. In other words, you can't charge him interest for the money that you loan the poor person. In other words, you can't make money off of them. It says, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury, so you can't charge interest. Verse 26. If you at all take your neighbor's raiment to pledge, in other words, it doesn't mean all their clothes, but it's talking about their coat. If you take their coat as a pledge that they promise to pay back, thou shalt deliver it, that is the coat, to them by the time the sun goes down. And verse 27 explains why. Remember, these are poor people. For that is his covering only. That's all he has. That's his covering only. It is his raiment for his skin. Wherein shall he sleep? In other words, he uses that same coat, that outer garment, as his blanket, because he doesn't have anything to keep him warm. And it shall come to pass when he cries to me, same thing with the widows and orphans, if he cries to me, and I will hear, for I am gracious. Next one, verse 28, thou shalt not revile. All right, now the is not in the Greek, and the word gods here is Elohim, which happens to be plural. But in Genesis 1:1, Elohim is translated God. In beginning, God created heaven and earth. So I believe this is not telling them they can't revile other gods, but I think it's saying they can't revile God. And then it says, nor curse the ruler of your people, because we know from Scripture that God places people in positions of authority, and we're not to curse them. Verse 29, thou shalt not delay to offer the first of the ripe fruits. Remember, that was to be brought to God, and they weren't allowed to delay it and wait a little bit. Now, I don't know when it, because the garden doesn't grow year-round unless you live in certain parts of the world, and the growing season is shorter in some places. Where I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, you couldn't plant till Memorial Day, and the harvest was Labor Day, and that was it. The only thing you could plant before Memorial Day was cabbage and onions. But anything else would be killed because the threat of frost or a hard freeze was still through the month of May. So, and it could get cold again after that. So it was a short growing season. But the point is, when you got those first ripe tomatoes, you're so excited because they taste better than anything you can get in the store. And you're so excited. Well, they were to bring these first fruits to God. So the tendency is here they could delay. It said, no, you're not allowed to delay. And then it says of your liquors. The word liquors here means from the vineyard, so it's talking about the wine from the grapes. The firstborn of your son shalt thou give to me. They didn't have to give and leave. They were committed or devoted to. Verse 30. Likewise shalt thou do with your oxen. Remember, they were supposed to bring the firstborn of them, of your bulls and your sheep. 7 days it shall be with his dam. The word dam is the word speaking of the animal's mother. The first 7 days, the animal would stay, and then they were to bring that firstborn to God. On the 8th day thou shalt give it to me. Verse 31. He shall, ye shall be holy men to me, neither shall ye eat any flesh that is torn of beast in the field. If an animal was torn by another animal, they couldn't eat it. Ye shall cast it to the dogs. So it was okay. Now the dogs has a twofold meaning. They could let dogs eat the meat. It was still okay for that. And dogs also implied people that weren't Jewish, because they didn't have the same dietary laws, and they could give it to other people that weren't Israelites. Okay, we have a little bit of time. We can start chapter 23. Thou shalt not raise a false report. That would be lying, right? But in particular, when in court. Put not your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. In other words, don't try to help somebody that's guilty by giving a report that's wrong. So siding with the wicked. Verse 2, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. I have heard parents say this to their children. So if all your friends were jumping off the cliff, you would just jump off with them? So it's this thing about do what everybody else is doing. Thou shalt not follow a multitude, a crowd of people to do evil. If it's wrong, it's bad. Now, in the context here, it's talking about court, but you can see the principle for everything. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. What that's talking about is you shouldn't do something that is going to stop the process. The word judgment here is justice. Stop this process of justice by declining to say what is true. Verse 3, neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. Now, verse 3 is the opposite of verse 6. So, in the one sense, they weren't allowed to, the word countenance has to do with give favor to a person because they're poor. If the poor is guilty, they're guilty, just like any other person. Not say, well, they're poor. If they did something wrong and they're in court, it's the same. Now, we got like 6 minutes, so maybe we'll get to verse 6, which is the opposite of that. Verse 4, if you meet your enemy's ox or his ass going astray, is there somebody that you're enemies with, and you see their bull or their donkey going off somewhere, thou shalt surely bring him back to him again. You're supposed to bring him back. Doesn't matter that he's an enemy. You're supposed to do that. Verse 5, if you see the ass of him that hates you, again an enemy, lying under his burden, the donkey, the load is too heavy, the donkey's down, you're supposed to help him up. And wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Verse 6 now is the opposite of verse 3. Thou shalt not wrest the judgment of the poor in his cause. So they weren't to take advantage of the poor. Yes, the poor, if they're guilty, they're guilty, but they weren't. If the poor are innocent, they weren't supposed to say, well, they're poor, we'll just do whatever we want to with them. Verse 7, keep you far from a false matter. Stay away from it. And the innocent and the righteous slay thou not. So it was wrong to take people that were innocent and accuse them of something. Don't put them to death. God says, for I will not justify the wicked, because you're the one being wicked if you are putting to death someone who's innocent. And God said, I will not justify the wicked. Verse 8, thou shalt take no gift. That's a bribe. Bribery was not allowed. Of course, remember, all this stuff is a lot of it what they did. But for the gift blinds the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. That's why college teams in football, and probably other sports too, I'm just more familiar with football, have been sanctioned for not following these rules. And they bribe the students to come to this college, and they try to do it quietly. I think offer, I have this nice house down in Florida. Your family wants to go down there and stay. So those are all perks. It happens in government. People get in government, and lobbyists want to get a vote to go their way, and so they offer them things. That's what bribes are. It blinds the wise. They start to overlook things that they wouldn't normally overlook, and so they become unwise. Verse 9, also thou shalt not oppress a stranger. Again, this is similar to before. For ye know the heart of a stranger. You know exactly what it's like to be a foreigner in a foreign land, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 10, at 6 years thou shalt sow your land, shalt gather in the fruits thereof. So every year for 6 years they were to plow the land. Then in verse 11 it says, but the 7th year thou shalt let it rest and lie still. So a lot of these rules were given for a specific reason, and a lot of people in agriculture knows if they just keep reusing the land year after year after year, it won't be as productive. It's better to occasionally let the land just rest and don't plant anything. So that's what they were supposed to do every 7th year. Let it rest, and this is why. Verse 11, that the poor of your people may eat. Because even though you don't plow up the ground and replant, there's going to be some plants grow, right? When you're harvesting, let's say you're talking about corn, if there's some corn kernels that fall on the ground, you're going to have some corn come up the next year. I have wild onions that grow in my yard every year. I have wild strawberries. There's lots of them. But there's some stuff that you don't have to plant. It's just going to come back, even though you don't plant a whole field. But that was to be for the poor. And what they leave, what the poor leave, the beasts of the field shall eat. So it'll be their food. All right, and then it says, in like manner thou shalt deal with your vineyard and with your olive yard. So they were supposed to do the same thing with the grapevines every 7th year, and that was supposed to be for the poor, the same with the olive trees. Verse 12. We'll just do 2 more verses tonight. 6 days thou shalt do your work. On the 7th day thou shalt rest. And this is the last thing we talked about in last Sunday night's message. So even though we don't have to keep a certain day, there's still the element of rest. We all need rest. It's not good to work 7 days a week. It's not healthy. So it's a good thing to rest. All right, the 7th day thou shalt rest, that your ox and your ass may rest. Now, they needed to rest too. Now, a lot of times we do things with machinery now. The machines don't necessarily have to rest. And the son of your handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. So your workers need some time off. Verse 13. And in all things that I have said to you, be circumspect, which means pay attention to. And make no mention of the name of other gods. Don't mention them. Neither let it be heard out of your mouth. They weren't allowed to even say the names of these other gods. Now, as I've been saying over as we're closing tonight, the Israelites disobeyed all of these, and they kept doing it. And they did say the names of other gods, and they were influenced. I mean, they're given instructions about when they go into the promised land, and they're not allowed to let anybody live. And they thought, oh, well, what would it hurt? And God told them that because if they did, they were going to be influenced by them and start to worship their gods, and that's what they did. All right, so a lot of details tonight in the things of the law, but know that God was doing it so that it would be fair. Let's close in prayer. Father, thank you tonight for reminding us of these things that you have given. And we know that in each country, in each state, in each jurisdiction where people live, there are different laws. And know that if we don't follow the laws, there are consequences. And though, because we're in a world that's not perfect, we know sometimes the innocent are given punishments they don't deserve, and those that are guilty are set free. But Father, we know when we stand at the judgment seat that it'll all be right. No errors, no mistakes. That we will give an account of what we've done in our Christian lives, whether we've been faithful to you or not. So help us as your children to do that. Again, we lift up all those tonight that are suffering from COVID. Continue to give them strength, and that they can heal quickly and return to fellowship. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.